Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar, which is part of the Grooming and Coercive Control Summit 2023, hosted by Neurodiverse Connection. If you haven't heard of us before, Neurodiverse Connection is a community interest company that exists to elevate the voices of neurodivergent people to help them flourish and thrive. The Grooming and Coercive Control Summit is our first ever event series, so we're delighted that you've chosen to join us and be part of this. Our aim for this summit is to start conversations, collate knowledge, and share lived experiences of grooming and coercive control. This is an issue that affects many lives, but is rarely talked about openly. We believe that challenging the stigma that surrounds it can help to accelerate positive change in this critical area. At Neurodiverse Connection, we are committed to promoting the use of neurodivergent affirming language. Our guide to neurodivergent affirming language is available in the resource library section of our website. However, please do note that in these webinars, as with any content that we host or share that has input from other organizations, we cannot guarantee that all of the preferred neurodivergent affirming terminology is always used. And due to the very nature of this summit, of course, there is a content warning for this and all of our webinars on grooming, abuse, and coercive control. You will be able to find a link to a curated list of support organizations that we've compiled in the chat, and we'll repost this at the end of the session as well for everyone. So, on with the show. This session is delivered by Dr. Amy Pearson. Amy is a developmental psychologist and senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Sunderland. Her current research focuses on understanding factors which impact on well-being among autistic people across their lifespan. In this talk, Amy presents findings from research which asked autistic people themselves about how they perceive and make sense of the experience of violence and what we can better do to support them. The aim of this research was to transcend the notion of individual vulnerability and to resituate heightened risk and negative outcomes within an ecological framework which acknowledges the wider role that stigma and ableism have to play in the outcomes of autistic people. We're very excited to hear what's to come. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Amy. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tom. And I hope that everyone can hear me okay, but do tell me if there are any issues. I've also realized that I don't have my pronouns on my name tag, but my pronouns are she, her. So I'm going to be talking about a piece of research today that we conducted, exploring the experiences of autistic adults who've experienced intimate violence and abuse. And there were two aims of this study, so I'm going to focus on one of the aims, but I am going to talk a little bit about some of the other findings because I think they provide a really important context for some of the support factors that I'll talk about later on. So on to the first slide. So I just wanted to start with a bit of a warning to take care within this talk. Obviously, I'm going to be talking about some fairly bleak things. As Tom said, it's really important that we talk about these things, but it's also can be, really harmful. So I do want you to take care of yourselves, do what you need to do. If you need to leave at any point, please do. Just, make sure that you're taking care of yourself while you're listening. So the piece of research that I'm going to present was conducted as part of a collaborative project, which was funded by the Violence, Abuse and Mental Health Network. And alongside myself on the team, we had Kieran Rose, who works as the autistic advocate, has published in both academic and non-academic literature, and does a lot of research with me on the experience of victimization and masking. We had Sarah Douglas, who is a research associate at the University of Bristol and also does a lot of work with SARSAS, which is an organisation that provides support for survivors of sexual and intimate violence. And we had Felicity Sedgwick, who is at the University of Bristol. Felicity works in the School of Psychology and Education and has done a lot of wonderful research into masking the experiences of autistic women and autistic relationships. And then finally, we had Monique Botha, who is based up at the University of Stirling. And Monique has done absolutely wonderful research looking at what it's like to be an autistic person working in academia, about the experience of epistemic injustice for autistic people and what we can do to improve autism research. So Monique's done research looking at minority stress, and how that impacts on well-being across the lifespan. So within the team, we have both autistic expertise, but also we have lived experience of intimate partner violence as well. And we thought that was really important for the project. We wanted to make sure that we had representation that aligned with the experiences of the people that we were going to interview. That was something we thought was really important for ensuring safety and also for thinking about the way we interpret people's experiences. So just a little bit of background, though I'm sure all of you are very familiar with these facts. Autism is a form of neurodivergence or neurodevelopmental disability, characterized by differences across a variety of different domains compared to the non-autistic population. So we tend to have a more singularly focused attentional processing. We have monotropic focus. We tend to communicate in a slightly different way. We move differently to non-autistic people, and we process sensory information differently. So being both hyper and hyposensitive to sensory input. And autism historically was characterized through social communication deficits. So autistic people were argued to have difficulty in communicating with others, in understanding others, and to lack interest or insight into the mental states and viewpoints of other people. And so up until fairly recently, research into autistic relationships has been incredibly sparse. It was thought that autistic people didn't really have relationships, let alone adult intimate relationships. And so it's something that's been notoriously absent from the literature, despite the fact that, you know, we see increases in the number of autistic children receiving a diagnosis, and those children have to come from somewhere. So we know that autistic people do have relationships, and the research emerging, as I'm sure is a surprise to absolutely no one, suggests that autistic people value very much the same things as neurotypical people within their relationships: empathy, compassion, shared interests, shared values. But we also know that autistic people are disproportionately likely to experience interpersonal forms of violence and abuse across the lifespan. So interpersonal violence is violence and abuse that is perpetrated by people that you know, so people like friends, family, and intimate partners. And autistic people experience this at an incredibly disproportionate rate. So I think the figures for intimate partner violence, sexual abuse, around 9 out of 10 autistic women. But for interpersonal violence more broadly, the figures put it somewhere between 50 to 90% of autistic people, which is half to almost all of autistic people have been victimized by someone they know across the lifespan. And a lot of the research into autistic victimization, again, up until fairly recently, had very much attributed this to difficulties in autistic people understanding the intentions of others, and not so much taking into account anything beyond that individual vulnerability. So vulnerability is something that we can all experience at any point in the lifespan. We can all be situationally vulnerable. You know, if we are a child, we tend to be more vulnerable because we're physically smaller, we're less able to defend ourselves against someone who is bigger and stronger than us. If we lose our job or lose our home, we might become more vulnerable through that lack of access to resource and becoming socially more marginalized. So framings of individual vulnerability amongst autistic people as kind of the explanation for increased violence really doesn't take into account those broader systems which tend to contribute towards the violence that autistic people experience. And they effectively take a bit of a victim blaming approach where it's like, well, if autistic people were better at spotting manipulative intentions, these things wouldn't happen, which is incredibly problematic. So we decided with this research to focus specifically on the experience of intimate violence and abuse. And as Susie Rideout has pointed out, autistic people are very much likely to be represented in statistical figures around intimate violence. But there is actually very little focus so far on autistic experiences and an understanding of what autistic people need to start to recover from the experience of intimate violence. If it is so prevalent, we're seeing huge numbers of people experience this. What do people have access to in terms of support, and what would they like to see? And we know that autistic people, as a really marginalized group in society, experience social stigma, so social judgments about ourselves that are incredibly negative, that tend to lead to that higher risk of violence. And this can provide barriers to accessing social supports. So making sense of your experiences, having access to the right language, but also being able to access services themselves and being able to access services that provide meaningful insight and the kind of support that you need. So this was something we wanted to pick on with this piece of research that I'm going to talk about. So we had two key aims within this study. The first was to understand how autistic people who've experienced intimate violence and abuse conceptualize what's happened to them and make sense of their experiences. So we thought that going beyond this assumption of individual vulnerability, that there are likely to be a variety of different factors that contribute towards how people recognize that they're in an abusive situation, how they work out what's going on, and work up the bravery to leave those situations, and how they then make sense of what's happened afterwards, which then contributes to that point of recovery. The second thing was to better understand the needs of autistic people, to think about what they want to see in terms of more effective support and recovery. So as I said, we know that people are well represented within the statistical data we have, but we have very little understanding of what autistic people actually need. And research so far suggested that autistic people maybe don't benefit from some of the therapies that neurotypical people tend to experience. So things like cognitive behavioral therapy maybe aren't as effective, aren't as tailored to autistic thinking styles. And that if we're going to provide more effective support, we really need to understand firsthand what autistic people want. So in order to do this, we interviewed 21 autistic adults, and we recruited 18 women, 1 man, and 2 non-binary participants. We aimed to try and have I think, a more representative gender sample, but the response we had was overwhelmingly from autistic women. Almost all of our participants were late diagnosed. The only one who wasn't late diagnosed was the only male participant. 11 of the participants are heterosexual and the rest were queer, pan or asexual or unsure. All of the participants were white. And again, this was something that when we recruited people, we really wanted to try and gain a diverse sample. It's really important that we understand autistic issues, I think social issues, through an intersectional perspective. So we need to think about the kinds of things that might provide additional risk, shall we say. We did have a few people kind of respond to the initial kind of call for participants that weren't white, but none of them responded to the invite to take part. And I think this might be for a couple of reasons. I think one might be that we're an all-white team, and that maybe doesn't foster that level of trust and comfort within people from racialized minorities. And that's something I think is really important to address in future. But I also wondered whether we didn't have a larger response from people, because of that, but also because of some issues there around access to diagnosis, support, self-knowledge, and stereotypes that we tend to see within those diagnostic processes. 15 of the people who took part had a kind of a clinical formal diagnosis, and self was 6ID'd or awaiting diagnosis. And the average age of participants was 42, but ranged from 25 to 78. So we had quite a wide spread of people taking part in terms of age. And we gave people a couple of different options for taking part. So we used semi-structured interviews, and the participants had the option to meet with a researcher. So these are the 2 researchers, Wendy Joseph and Alex Mitchell. Both have experience in counselling training and have done work with a variety of different organisations. So they were absolutely wonderful to have on the project. So participants could meet with Wendy or Alex to talk about their experiences, or they were also able to provide a written interview. And the majority of people who took part gave a spoken interview, but a few did choose to write their accounts instead, which meant that we were able to go through and then ask for more detail if needed. We also had everyone who took part complete a safety plan, which is based on some of the work done by Sarah Cassidy and Jackie Rogers. And effectively, we sent out some detail about the kinds of things we were going to ask them, the list of questions. And then we also asked them a list of questions about their own needs. So things like how we would know if they were becoming distressed and what they would like us to do if that happened. So what kind of support they would like, whether they wanted to have someone with them, anything that would kind of make the process more comfortable, given that they were going to be talking about these really harrowing experiences. All of the spoken interviews were recorded and transcribed. And then the data was entered into a software program called NVivo for coding. So I'm going to talk you through the analytic process a little bit. So we use a reflexive thematic analysis to analyze the data. I am a big fan of reflexive thematic analysis. I like the kind of flexibility that it gives to the analytic process. So in order to do this, I entered the transcripts into NVivo, and I read them multiple times and kind of went through and started making notes against them, and then started assigning codes. And the coding was done on an inductive basis, which means that it was kind of really open and organic. I didn't have a set list of things I was drawing from. It was just as things came up that seemed important, then I would start to code that. And the codes were based on both literally what people said, so the semantic content of their statements, but also the latent content of their statements. So kind of what might be underlying what people have said and the experiences that they're talking about. What did that seem to be underpinned by? And I drew upon standpoint epistemology during the coding process. So standpoint epistemology is a feminist epistemology, which effectively notes the importance of lived experience within the coding and the data analyzing process, thinking about your own interpretations and how that enables you to bring your unique insight into this. And as an autistic person and someone who has experienced intimate violence, I was really aware of my own biases, how that might impact my own interpretations. And I kept a reflexive diary throughout the process. So when I was analyzing the data, if I had any particular feelings about it, I would note that down and think about where that might be coming from, what that might be making me think. And I also discussed this with my collaborators, particularly Monique. We would have regular meetings where I would talk about the data and the kinds of things that it was bringing up for me. I originally had an absolutely huge list of codes. So we started off with about 350. And then I narrowed those down. So going through and thinking, well, actually, those things are, they're synonyms, or those things are really similar. I've just used different words there. Contextually breaking things down into smaller and smaller sets of information. And then once I had that into a really refined set of codes, I met with Monique and we started to organize the codes into themes. It took a really long time to analyze the data, partially because it was so rich. So the things and the accounts that people had given, what they'd said was really depthful, and there was a lot there to get through. But it was also a really emotional experience. There were times when I had to put the data down and think, okay, I'm going to go and take a break. I need to get my head out of this for a while because it was really emotionally affecting. So once we'd done that, we organized the final set of codes into themes and then just kept refining those until we had those final set of themes. We had 6 themes in total, 3 which were focused on concepts and 3 which were more focused on support and recovery. And those are the themes that I'm going to focus on for today. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about the kind of the other themes first. So the themes that were focused on conceptualizations very much noted the impact of power dynamics, the experience of stigma, and then that process of sense making. So the people who we'd interviewed had spent their entire lives feeling like they didn't have choices, and that made them particularly manipulable for other people. So they felt like they didn't have any agency. They just had to do what other people told them. And that seemed to stem from very early experiences in life. So people noted things like, not having a choice when you want to go to the bathroom at school. Even small things like that instill this sense of a lack of agency where you feel like you don't have control over your own life. And other people's understanding of life and other people's choices are better than yours. And that interacted with this sense of stigma around being autistic, whether people knew that they were autistic or not. That experience of being different and constantly being told, well, actually, the way you interpret this situation is not correct. Your interpretation is less correct than other people's. Again, led to this sense that other people must know more than them. They're more worthwhile, they're more correct, and they're in some ways more human. So people noted feeling like they weren't particularly human compared to others, that they were less of a person and that they were somehow inherently worth less. And this made it really difficult for people to recognize that what was happening to them was abusive. In part, this came from the actions of the perpetrator and how they used coercive control in order to manipulate the understanding of the situation. So they would tell people things like, well, I'm not really hurting you. This isn't really happening. Or I've only hurt you a little bit and not a lot. So you should just be thankful that things couldn't be worse. And this caused a massive sense of confusion for our participants, thinking, well, if I'm being told that it could be worse, that must be the truth, because other people have always told me that I don't interpret things correctly. So this must just be me. And it made it so that regardless of the kinds of violence that people are experiencing, whether it was emotional or physical, they always thought that that situation could be worse. So people who'd experienced primarily emotional and coercive control, they thought, well, at least I haven't been hit. Or if they've been hit, they'd be like, well, I haven't been hit a lot. And people who had experienced physical violence would say, well, at least it wasn't a punch. At least it wasn't a broken bone. There was always a sense that things could be worse. And that made it difficult for people to recognize what was happening to them was truly abusive, but also to recognize that they deserved access to support because they felt like what they were experiencing wasn't bad enough to warrant taking up resources. So I'm going to focus with the other three themes on that process of recovery and the idea of recovery as a journey. I'm also going to look at how we stop this. So how do we think about the kinds of factors that we need to focus on in terms of intervention to improve outcomes for autistic people? And then finally, how we build better systems. So not just focusing on individuals, but thinking about how we improve things from that really kind of view from above. So that first theme, recovery as a journey, the name of this, we really wanted to encapsulate the idea that recovery isn't a destination. So you don't ever really recover from these experiences. They don't go away. It's not something that you can forget. And this was summed up really concisely by Lydia, who said, you know, the support that she had afterwards gave her the opportunity to do courses and get the tools that she needed. And she compared this to having a broken leg years ago, that it impacted her and it happened, but she can't forget that it happened. You know, that bone has healed, but she'll never forget that her leg was broken. Much the same as she'll never forget that relationship she was in, but she's been able to move on a little bit. And I think one of the things we saw across the people we interviewed was that recovery was certainly not something that was static, and it wasn't something that was necessarily a happy ending. That when we think about good outcomes for people, I think we tend to think about this as people being completely healed, completely happy, and able to just crack on with their lives. And actually, for some people, recovery meant not trusting people. It meant looking after themselves primarily at first and thinking about what they needed instead of necessarily jumping back into relationships and then thinking that things could be better. So Michelle said, you know, I'm the opposite now. I think everyone's a liar. I think men have ulterior motives and I can't step away from that. It's like I don't give them the opportunity. And likewise, Rachel said, you know, I'm struggling to comprehend the possibility of a non-abusive romantic relationship because I don't really know what that would look like. And I can't really imagine that it's possible. I don't feel like I could recognize the signs of abuse if it were to happen again. So this recovery process isn't something that just kind of occurs and you're better and then all of your relationships are fine. We need to provide people better support in that journey, but maybe recognize that actually recovery for some people might look like pulling away for a certain period of time. It might look like being really distrustful. And it might look like having to provide people with support in order to feel like they are empowered if they do want to enter a relationship again, to recognize the signs of abuse or to feel like they can reach out to people when they do need to talk about those difficulties. Maybe it might be that you actually do struggle to recognize it on your own, but you know, if you have a good support network and people there who can help you make sense of things, that can also help. One of the things we found really important for this recovery journey was a sense of empowerment. So as I said previously, many of the people we spoke to had experienced feeling like they were worthless for much of their lives. They didn't have very much self-belief or self-confidence, and they very much felt dehumanized compared to other people, like there was something broken about them. And one of the things that contributed towards a sense of recovery was the development of self-compassion and of self-worth. And some of this came through empowerment from engagement with outside services. So Jessica talked about the experience of counseling and said she had a free course of counseling. And when that 8 weeks finished, she went back and continued having counseling and paying for that. And she talked about that it taking a while to accept that that was okay because previously she hadn't been in control of her own money and she didn't feel like she could spend anything. And so it took a long time to recognize that actually spending that money on herself was something that she could do. But being able to do that really heavily contribute towards her sense of empowerment and feeling like, okay, I have a bit of strength here. I'm gaining my agency back. Rachel also spoke about having support from outside people who could help validate those experiences. So she talked about experiences with a social worker who clearly explained everything related to her individual situation and explained the rationale and the reasoning for everything that she was recommending. She said she wrote down information and provided reassurance and validation. And that approach was exactly what I needed. So someone who's there, who's able to be really clear, really concise, and gives you what you need in order to understand the situation. So people don't just need to be kind of like packaged off. We're going to send you to a therapist, or we're going to get you into safe housing. People need to know what's going on. They need that depthful understanding and what the rationale is. A lot of the people we spoke to said one of the things that had impacted on them making sense of their situation was that everyone's accounts are different, right? We all have these really different experiences. But when you're going through it, it can be really difficult then to go, oh, well, that's a little bit different from my situation. So maybe that doesn't apply to me. And, oh, well, this exact thing didn't happen. So maybe it wasn't abusive. And that actually having very clear information from other people alongside validation and being like, well, actually, your situation might not be the same, but these seem like the things that are happening. This is what you might need. That can help people, again, to feel empowered to make sense of things themselves rather than trying to rely on that kind of outside representation, which can be so variable. And finally, within this theme, we found one of the key issues, again, was knowing when to disclose or when to intervene. So the idea of reaching out for help versus people reaching in to help you. And within this, so people talked about the idea of that disclosure being a repeat event, that, you know, it's a long process. As Catherine said, you might have to keep reaching out for support over and over again. It's not like my mum marched me to the GP and I got therapy and then it's over. You might have to keep reaching out for support. So it might be that, you know, the support you're initially offered isn't effective. It's not what you need, or actually a course of 8 weeks of therapy isn't going to help you feel better. You might need more prolonged help than that. And that having that knowledge about it not being like a one and done and things are fixed is really helpful. But also being aware that you might have to continually keep on disclosing this really harrowing situation to other people. And that in itself takes a massive toll, having to keep telling people this is what happened to me. And that it can be really difficult to disclose to people. There was a sense that it had to be the right time, and that it was important that people didn't come in really heavy-footed, kind of like, oh, you're being abused, I know how to help, because that's really unhelpful. So people talked about, you know, friends and family wanting to intervene, but, you know, not feeling like at that point that was the right time for them. And if it had happened, they would have just gone like, no, everything's fine, I'm okay, like I don't really want to talk about it. So being really gentle. Rowan says, you know, it's really important to not scare somebody off if they're about to disclose something to you. So like if you say you're unsafe and then someone's like, I'll call this number, that's really bad. You need to choose the moment and choose what you say to people really carefully. And sometimes what people need is just someone there to listen, but also someone there to provide support. So one of the participants talked about, you know, needing to go and stay with a friend for the night when she felt really unsafe, and how he just, you know, he didn't really ask what was going on. He just put the couch up for her, got all the blankets out and gave her a safe place to stay for the night. And, you know, didn't force her to disclose, didn't put any pressure on. And that just gave that little bit of safety to start to think, okay, what do I need to do in this situation? And then finally, that idea of seeing other people sharing their stories. So Helen highlighted that representation that we do see needs to be more varied. That you might occasionally see like a TV storyline, or someone else mentioned The Archers, the radio show, having a kind of a storyline around coercive control and how actually that was really powerful. But having an amplification of people's voices and hearing the variation in stories, what Helen described as different extremes, said you only hear a lot of these things through the right support networks or knowing someone who's gone through it. So having spaces where these voices are amplified that people can access, so, you know, spaces online where people can anonymously access information, hear about what's happened to other people, not in a, I guess, an objectifying way, but just being able to make sense of things alongside other people who've had similar experiences, that can really help. And it can help you recognize that it's not just you on your own going through this, that there are other people having similar experiences. And again, that can make people feel like, okay, well, I can talk about this now and disclose. One of the things that came out in the other set of themes was this idea of hermeneutical justice and having the right language to describe experiences. And Lydia specifically talked about coercive control as something that could be prosecuted. That language being used, and when that finally came about, that change in legislation, that it allowed her to really kind of go, that's what happened to me. And now when people talk about what happened to me in the past, I can say, no, it was this. This is why I didn't leave. And it made her feel like she didn't blame herself anymore, was how she phrased it. So she could say she wasn't the one to blame for not leaving. So yeah, it can be really important to have the right language and have access to that from people who are similar to you, from people in those communities that you're part of. So the second theme was focused on those individual factors that we might need to take into account for trying to prevent the experience of intimate violence. And the first thing that we found was the idea that it's really important to recognize interpersonal vulnerability. So I find vulnerability a really problematic construct. As I said at the beginning, we can very much use it as a bit of a framework of reliance for saying, well, people are more vulnerable because of X, Y, Z, instead of saying, actually, a lot of that is the problem of society. And we need to think about how to look at that from a broad perspective. But the people we did speak to overwhelmingly highlighted how they perceived other people impacting on them spotting manipulative behavior. So, Jessica said, I find it really difficult to distinguish when someone's being genuine or not. And that does definitely impact. And it definitely impacts still. I struggle with that in general. And so actually acknowledging that and saying, well, we need to find a way to talk about these things without blaming autistic people for their experiences. We need to be able to say, this is a problem, but let's think about what we can do to try and address that without saying the onus to fix this is on you. The other thing that came up was that it wasn't just being autistic that caused some of the difficulties. So all of the people we spoke to were neurodivergent in multiple ways. And being ADHD was also particularly highlighted as impacting on people's experiences. So Grace said, it's about being medicated for ADHD for me. I'm less likely to seek out really high risk situations, whereas before I was drawn to them. And some of our autistic and ADHD participants said, I would find it really difficult to tell the difference between what felt like danger and what felt like excitement. And then sometimes I was in a really dangerous situation and it was like, oh no, I don't know how I got myself into this. So making sure that we're not just focusing on this through a purely autistic lens, that we're thinking about other forms of neurodivergence and how that might interact to produce really intersectional and unique forms of vulnerability for people there. But really what we need to focus on is education, right? So everyone talked about the importance of education. We can think about individual factors and individual interventions, ways to make people feel more empowered to recognize abuse. But that starts with educating people about what healthy relationships and unhealthy relationships actually look like. So Catherine said, I think if schools actually spoke about this, they do loads on road safety and drugs and alcohol, but relationships is something everyone has, whether that's a friendship, a romantic relationship, or a family relationship. Understanding what a healthy relationship is vital. They get sex education, but there's a relationship typically there before you get to that point. So to jump into it without understanding what a healthy functional relationship is just doesn't make sense. And this was something that we saw everyone valued, the idea that we could, I guess, prevent a lot of these occurrences by educating young people about healthy relationships and about how to advocate for themselves and set boundaries. So a lot of the people that we spoke to had felt like consent was something for other people. that consent was something that other people got to have that they didn't, and that boundaries was something that other people got to have that they didn't. And so being able to talk to young people about, and like in an age appropriate way, you know, how should friends treat each other? What are good ways to treat people in a relationship? What might be a bad sign in a relationship? And also thinking about how that might interact with neurodivergence. So at the moment, we're in the process of pulling together a resource on healthy relationships, specifically aimed at autistic people. And one of the things we think it's really important to cover is that nuance of there are some things that might be bases as a red flag. So one of the things we thought of here was like getting into a relationship really quickly. And that might be with two neurodivergent people just because you've got hyper focused on each other and like become super excited and super interested in learning as much as you can about the other person. On its own, that might not necessarily be a red flag. But in the presence of other things, so that person wanting to be really controlling about who you speak to, about your money, about where you go, in the presence of that, that's definitely a red flag. And so being able to be a little bit more nuanced about how we talk about these things to kind of, I guess, not take a very neuronormative approach to vulnerability. And then finally, the arguably hardest aspect of this to address in terms of improving support is building better systems. And there are a couple of key issues here. The first was a need for more practical support. So Lydia said, you know, he left me in a financial mess, and I'm always grateful for the local authority house because it kept the children in the same school in the same village. And that practical support, I was in the right place at the right time of the services helping people. I think I've got another quote from Lydia on a later slide, which relates to this, but she effectively spoke about if those things aren't available to you and you can't access them. So, you know, there is no local service for providing support for people who've experienced violence, or, you know, it's really hard to get benefits while you're having to find somewhere else to live, or you've had to leave your job and you know, leave your home. That can make it even more difficult for survivors. And Rachel talked about the need for consideration of really practical hands-on support. So I said, you know, thinking about changing, you know, where you live, you need to set up a new GP, you might need to access the local services, you might need to learn how to navigate the new area or how to make friends. And a lot of the time it isn't considered that those things, even things like completing paperwork, could be challenging for someone. But for many autistic people, those things can provide a massive barrier to accessing the support that people need. So we need to consider that and how we could provide more practical support for people. It was also highlighted that many support services are just really inaccessible. So people highlighted the phone, so needing to telephone somewhere in order to get access to support. A lot of autistic people aren't going to want to do that. And also having, again, sets of information that are really general and not necessarily tailored to the kinds of specific issues that people might have can make it difficult to, okay, well, my experiences don't align exactly with this, so maybe I'm not experiencing that. And having therapy which is tailored. So Catherine said, you know, CBT didn't help. I had people telling me to do stupid things like evoke a panic attack or the emotions of a panic attack, and that's just not helpful. So not using this out of the box approach. And it was overwhelmingly highlighted that we need better knowledge about autistic people embedded within services, but also practical experience of working with autistic people and having training which is either co-designed with or delivered by autistic people themselves. So, you know, Alison said, this training is compulsory for a lot of spaces now. It's part of the Autism Act, but people either aren't being offered it or they don't have the time to do it, or they go for one day of training and they think they know everything. And, you know, they don't really have the time to build up that meaningful and depthful knowledge. And Alison talked about effectively going on some training herself, where she sat for the day and they talked about autistic people. And, you know, she said everyone was nodding along and it was great. Like they're all really taking it in. And then at the end of the day, someone opened a bag of crisps and ate them really loudly next to her. And that might sound like a really silly thing, but she was like, she literally just hadn't considered. She'd heard all of this stuff about sensory information and misophonia and the noises that people make, and then just like hadn't even considered that she could be sat next to an autistic person who had sensory issues. Like, it's that taking that theoretical knowledge and thinking about how we can make that more applied. So not just thinking, what is this like in theory, but making assumptions that autistic people are in the room with you, that we are there, and you do need to think about how these things work from a really interpersonal perspective. People also talk about the importance of knowledge about trauma and a kind of a humanistic, person-centered approach, and how to a degree sometimes that even in the face of a therapist who isn't as knowledgeable about autistic people, just having that kind of really trauma-informed, person-centered approach could mitigate some of that, because they're treating you more as an individual instead of thinking about, okay, how do I apply this really out of the box approach and this really manualized perspective. And then finally, there was a huge issue with systemic problems. So justice was inaccessible. And I think Helen and Alison will probably talk a little bit more about this, or have talked a little bit more about this. I'm not sure of the order of the program with that. But effectively, police were focused on evidence. They just wanted to make sure that there was enough evidence there. And if there wasn't, or if they felt that people would be an unreliable or incredible witness, they weren't interested. There were resource issues and services not talking to each other. So, police weren't contacting refuges, or the refuges weren't passing information on to police. And there was just a breakdown in that, leading to a case going nowhere. And the people we spoke to didn't necessarily feel listened to or safe in those experiences with the police. So, James said, I felt like they were going to question and blame me and take me away. Like, I didn't feel like I could raise this with them. And again, Lydia talked about those systemic issues societally being more of a problem. So, I said I was a single mum under the Blair Brown government, and it meant that I had 18 months without working on benefits. And they didn't give me luxuries, but they gave me enough to live on. There was no such thing as a food bank then. And this literally, when I read this, I had a bit of an existential crisis. Like, I sat and I had a little cry in the office, and I thought, this is such a huge issue. And I'm not sure how we're going to adequately address these things with these systems that we have, because she's right, there was no such thing as a food bank, or at least no one really used them, and I think thinking about these issues from that really broad strokes approach, what can we do, what policies do we need to change, how can we affect change on a really large scale level, and make sure that people who have the power to make these changes care. That is a very difficult undertaking, but it's so incredibly important. And then thinking about, the difference between survivor-informed services versus survivor-reliant services. So one of the things that came out was that most of the people we spoke to were engaged in some way in supporting victim survivors. They were either volunteering with different charities, with support services, or with the police. And it's great, and it's really important that we have autistic victim survivors informing that support in these organizations. But it also suggests that there's a reliance on those victim survivors to be the ones providing support. And that is effectively relying on traumatized people to be doing the work for other traumatized people. And I think we need to think really carefully about, again, resourcing grassroots groups and what we can do to make sure that people are getting effective support while not having a huge amount of pressure put on other survivors to be the ones to provide that for them. So just to kind of finish off and summarize, some of the major issues we saw across services was a lack of applied understanding about autistic people. So this quote from Lucy here says, I thought my partner was going to kill me, and they listened to him over me because I couldn't verbalize anything. They just weren't equipped. Many of the people we spoke to had unreliable verbal communication. When they were really distressed, they would lose the ability to communicate using speech. And the police just didn't get that whatsoever. It wasn't something that they had knowledge of how to deal with, and they didn't feel like they could communicate, which again led to processes falling flat or favoring the perpetrator. We need to think about a lack of access to resources overall. So one of the things highlighted was, there's a lack of internet in the refuge, which leads to increased social isolation. Staff misusing facilities, using the laundry service during the day so that the people who were staying there couldn't use it. And then a massive issue, which was viewing distress as challenging behavior. So this was seen in therapeutic support services in particular, by Rachel, who said, I asked for help with finding somewhere to live, and I requested that my discharge be delayed so everything could be sorted out. I could find somewhere, we could make sure the right community support was in place, and that the discharge would be successful. And I was accused of not wanting to get better. And not recognizing distress among neurodivergent people is something that is overwhelmingly contributes towards further trauma within our population, and something that we really need to think about very carefully. And then a lack of funding leading to a race to the bottom. So people thinking they weren't bad enough to help, and then being told when they reached out, you're not really bad enough to help, which led to further confusion. And things like the phone and not looking beyond the immediate context. But there were some pockets of great practice that people highlighted. So access to anonymous services and resources, having social workers who are really knowledgeable and able to provide support on, things like risk management, give practical advice, design safety plans for people, and staff who do see beyond what's in front of them. And this is a quote from Lydia, who said, I did something a bit naughty. I knew I needed help, so I convinced him, partner at the time, and the GP that I was suicidal, but I wasn't. And this was in the 90s. So I was referred straight to a psychiatric ward. They wouldn't see me separate to him, and I just couldn't understand why. They looked at him and they said, we're admitting her for 2 weeks. Go home and get her some night clothes. And then they turned around and they said to me, we need to give you a break from this. And she talked about how they were able to recognize something there, that they could tell she wasn't safe. And I'm not saying here that we need to expect, services and individuals who work for them to be mind readers. Like you can't see what's going on often in these situations, but being able to look beyond that immediate context and say, okay, well, we need to work out what's causing you to feel like this, rather than just treating what you see. If someone is incredibly distressed, what could be causing the distress, and how do we fix that? So having counseling and training led by neurodivergent people, making sure it's knowledgeable, compassionate, and safe. And then people talked about some practical support from the police. So things like installing alarms. Some people had experienced regular check-ins, and that had really helped to, facilitate that sense of safety. But it wasn't accessible to everyone. And there seemed to be a sense that actually good support was somewhat of a postcode lottery, that it very much depended on where you lived as to whether you could access it or not. So in summary, for autistic adults who've experienced intimate violence, this abuse appears to be very much normalized across the lifespan. It's cyclical, so it happens again and again, and it's underpinned by a sense of otherness. And we can't discount people being autistic as not being a key part of this experience. It's important to survivors, and we need to understand autism and autistic people in order to help people make sense of what's happened to them and provide better support. Autistic people do see themselves as at heightened risk due to things like normalization, stigma, and difficulties in interpreting social intentions, but also the features of neurodivergence. Services need better autistic-led training, funding, and accessibility considerations. And finally, recovery is a journey. It's not an end goal. It's not something that everyone needs to reach. It's not the pinnacle. Just helping people with what they feel like they need really should be the goal for people in recovery. So I just want to say thank you for listening and for attending the webinar, and thank you to Neurodiverse Connection for putting on this absolutely phenomenal event. I've relinked the resources page of the website there. If there's anything that you want to read about or gain access to support organizations, please do click that. But otherwise, I will say thank you to you all for listening, and to my wonderful collaborators, to everyone who took part in this research, and go to questions if people have them.
Amy, thank you so much. There was so much interesting stuff in that session. That was a treat is kind of the wrong word considering the content, but that was super interesting. If anyone has any questions to submit, please go ahead and submit them through the Q&A. We have a couple in already, and a couple of our own that we'll start with, but please do send us any ideas that you have for questions. I think something that stuck out to me was that that circularity in your presentation, where one of the first points you raised was this this kind of alarming personal sort of shifting baseline syndrome of it's not bad enough to, it's not as bad as being punched, it's not as bad as being this, it's not, and constantly finding something that kind of delays that impetus to seek help.
Yeah.
And I was just struck by the symmetry of that with one of your final points about cash strapped services having to make those decisions of, you're not bad enough to help, you don't count as, you don't fall within the stricter and stricter kind of definition of who we can help, and just how it's so unsurprising that people tend to this kind of trauma response of minimizing their experience, when that is actually what is happening on a macrocosmic scale with the services that are supposed to help them. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that kind of parallelism, whether that's an overly simplistic parallel to draw, perhaps, or, yeah, if you had any thoughts on that.
No, I think that's a great point. And this is one of the things that I think, like, the answer is usually we need more money. But I think in parallel with that, and if we change the experiences of neurodivergent people so that they don't believe that these things are normal and they don't feel like they deserve to be treated like that, then we're going to lower the need for those services or lower the pressure on those services in the long run. So I think it's about taking a very kind of, I guess, a future thinking approach to this, of thinking, okay, well, in the immediate future, we need to provide better services. We need things that are more informed, and we do need access to organizations for people who've experienced a variety of different things. That the people that we spoke to, it wasn't just, and to a degree for a lot of people, I think it wasn't the physical violence that had the most lasting impact. It was the emotional violence and the coercive control that very much fed into people questioning their own understanding of the situation and not trusting themselves, not trusting other people. So recognizing that it really is important to have that support, but also thinking, if we then also come up from that bottom-up approach and think about, well, how do we improve the way in which society views and treats autistic and neurodivergent people? How do we improve early educational relationships? How do we make sure people feel empowered and believe that they deserve better, feel like they can set boundaries and advocate for themselves? In the long run, that will lessen some of that pressure, because those services will be just not as needed. And I think balancing that out is a really difficult thing to do, because we do need to do both. But hopefully one will, in the long run, lessen the need for the other to a degree, I would hope.
A really interesting answer. And yes, that refrain of more money and the need for long-term thinking, that would, yeah, that would be a novelty, wouldn't it?
Good. It would be nice.
A question from one of our attendees, a really interesting point from Cheryl. She says she read in slides about schools needing to provide XYZ, I think relationship coaching training in the,
Yes.
similar to sex education, relationship education. From a pastoral head, PSHE lead, so many different pressures from senior management, including putting these subjects onto the carousel, the incredibly compressed time limit of that, and it concerns her that we still ask for the same needs 21 years on from them starting in education.
Yeah, this is another massive systemic issue, isn't it? And it's always time. Like I do quite a few, usually call them outreach sessions with schools, like, training, talking about neurodiversity, particularly talking about things like masking. And teachers have an overwhelming appetite for it. They're always like, we're desperate for this knowledge. We really want to know how to better support our students, but the time and the money in order to facilitate that. And I think time is usually the bigger issue. And I do think it's something that's a systemic problem. Like, we need recognition from educational bodies that these things are incredibly important. I remember some of the things that we had to cover at school, and I think actually, if we'd have actually focused on things that are real life issues for people, so basing this on statistically what seem to be the key future issues that people experience upon leaving school. How do we somehow feed that into the curriculum, or at least give people time to cover it? But it also needs to be just not schools. That education also needs to come from families, from parents. There's obviously a huge amount of pressure on parents as well, and a lot of disagreement around types of parenting and the way in which things are done. But teaching people about boundaries and agency, and recognizing their own needs and worth, is something that can be done in the home as well as in schools, and that should be done in those settings too.
I think that's really interesting. I think that also provides a way that kind of research and support organizations can try and directly help by producing resources or collating or sharing resources that help parents or guardians or anyone in an environment outside of a school environment to be able to have those conversations, to equip them to kind of plug those gaps where a time and cash strapped education system maybe in the current climate can't realistically accommodate those things. So I think that's really interesting. That leads on to another point from one of our attendees, asking for recommendations. Insightful reflections relating to intersectionality. Very interested in any good practice to inform resources on educating children and young people on healthy relationships, if you'd encountered any particularly useful resources in your work.
Not so far, unfortunately. And this is one of the things that prompted us to try and develop something. Because there's really not a great deal out there, particularly for neurodivergent people. I do know there's some things in the works. So I know that a colleague of mine, who is, I want to get this correct, I think she was originally a speech and language therapist or an occupational therapist. I always mix the two up. But Kate Boot is in the process of writing a book on relationship and sex education aimed at neurodivergent people, which I think is really important. I'm hoping our resource will be really useful. We're also having that. So I'm in the process of kind of finalizing the draft at the moment, but we're also having that edited to provide a kind of a plain language version and an accessible, easy read version, to just try and reach as many people as possible with that. But yeah, thank you. I hope we do see more of these things in future. And I think it's one of those issues that as more people start talking about it, we're bound to see more information emerge. I'm always dubious about like when things are picked up on social media and then there's variability in the quality of infographics, with such nuanced situations, but often more people talking about something is a good thing.
Definitely. I think it's also worth mentioning that later on in this webinar series on Friday, we have a webinar that specifically speaks to unraveling the complexity of neurodivergence through an intersectional lens. That's delivered by Wada Farah, who has done lots of work with Neurodiverse Connection before. We're really looking forward to that. So might be worth checking out that session if you're able to join. We'd love to see you there. Unfortunately, there's so many great questions coming in, but we have to wrap up the session there, I'm afraid. I'm so sorry. Amy, thank you so much for a terrific session. That was so enlightening, so illuminating. Thank you for sharing your work. Thank you to all of our attendees as well for your questions. That was so wonderful to see this lively debate popping up in the chat bot, in the Q&A box. We hope that you've all enjoyed this webinar as part of the Grooming and Coercive Control Summit, and we hope to see you at some of our other talks. Again, thank you all so much for joining us. Take care. Goodbye.